Nice to see you all. Although at any given point, I can only see one screen at a time, but I know you're all there. So it's nice to have so many people here and so many familiar faces on the screen. I appreciate that as well. I don't want to start off with a big negative, but I do have a complaint to make to our American colleagues, because for 4 years you had that orange-haired guy, and whatever happened in Canada, we could always say, well, it's worse in the United States because they got Trump. And now you got this rookie, this new kid, who's just burning up the tracks, and he's making our government look kind of timid and slow. So I really think that's you didn't pay enough attention to our needs to have somebody that we could compare to and feel good about. So the only thing we got left to brag about right now is our healthcare system. And if Biden changes that for the better, then we're toast, aren't we? Anyway, I should be serious because it's a serious topic at hand, and that's the COVID crisis. And I want to play a little trick on you, because I want to read you something and ask you to imagine what jurisdiction it comes from. It says, it is a sad reflection on neoliberal policies that it takes a watershed moment such as a global pandemic to acknowledge the need for well-funded public services and the workers that deliver them. But the last year has made the drawbacks of privatization and budget cuts an unavoidable fact. And there is now a broad understanding that we need a revaluing of the public sector. We cannot go back to the austerity policies of a pre-pandemic world. We must build back better. That is the message of the millions of public service workers. And you know what? The awful thing about that is that there is nothing in that quotation that would give you any ability to place it, because that's almost a worldwide phenomenon. It's certainly in country after country, the same thing could have been said and is being said. Because for 20 years, we've been facing, in much of the world, a huge experiment in unrestrained capitalism. We had tax cuts for the wealthy. We had tax cuts for profitable corporations. We had privatizations. We had deregulation. We had cuts in public services. And we had a tax on unions in country after country. And you know as well as I do that that experiment was a disaster. It was a disaster for people, and it was a disaster for the planet, in fact. And that disaster was totally predictable. Totally predictable. Anybody who looked at that set of policies would have known what the outcome was going to be. It caused an incredible level of income and wealth inequality. And on the other end of that, poverty and hardship. Now, COVID is a terrible crisis. But as Elise said, this terrible crisis showed us that the system that was built out of these decades of unrestrained capitalism was incapable of responding to that kind of a crisis. It was incapable of serving people unless they were wealthy. It exposed huge cracks and holes and wounds in our system. Our healthcare system was weaker than it should have been. It was underfunded. The need for universally accessible childcare that was affordable to everybody was just exposed. It should have been dealt with years and years ago. It should have been dealt with decades ago. And we had to find out again during the COVID crisis how important childcare was for our people and our economy. In both countries, I think, we warehoused our seniors in for-profit homes where the intention was to make money, not to provide adequate care to our seniors. And in both countries, I think we saw an indefensible level of illness and death as a result of that warehousing approach. And you know, the poor and racialized in both of our countries got sicker than people with wealth and power. They got sicker, there was more deaths, they faced more economic dislocation, more job loss, and more income loss. And during all of that, the wealthy got wealthier. In Canada, we don't have as many billionaires as you do in the United States, so we got some. And they got $58 billion richer in the pandemic than they were before. Our billionaires, a fewer of them, 58 billion more money than they had before. So eventually we're going to come out of the pandemic. And so do we want to go back to normal? Absolutely not. We need to build a new normal, a people-centered, worker-centered normal. We had a federal government budget recently that was interesting. It was very good in one sense because it was absolutely not an austerity budget. But it was also very disappointing in another sense because there was no reflection in that budget of the need to tackle income inequality and wealth inequality. And there was no reflection of one of the main pillars of that, which is fair taxation. there was, we had an introduction of a luxury tax on yachts. That was the only noticeable tax measure in the federal budget. Now, there's a few people who have yachts, but if you got yachts big enough to pay a luxury tax, it's not going to hurt you all that much. And basically, the fundamental tax system was not changed. So, look, like in the United States, where you've got some state governors that are Neanderthals at best, we have some. We have some provincial governments that will be all too ready to embrace austerity, and they will claim that they spent it all fighting COVID and they've got no choice left but to cut, slash, and burn because, gee golly, where are they going to find the money, and we can't run into debt, and all the stuff you've heard over and over again. So we're aware of that. We've got governments that are already talking about austerity before we've even gotten to the end of COVID, for heaven's sake. So we're building a toolbox that's going to, we hope, help us to respond to that. And the first part of the toolbox is to remind people that essential means essential. And you can't be essential in March and then be laid off in February and not have that make any sense. And yet that's what we're facing. We've got governments that are talking about our healthcare workers as being heroes, and those heroes are now being faced with layoffs or wage rollbacks at the bargaining table. So if you're essential, you're essential, you're essential. And you can't sort of pick and choose which month you're going to be essential in. Secondly, we're going to make the argument again that public services and public spending build the economy. They don't cost, they add to the economic growth of the country. If there's a layoff in the public sector, you don't only lose a public sector job, you lose a couple of spin-off jobs in the private sector. If you freeze wages, which we're all too familiar with in Canada, then you don't only freeze the money that goes to public sector workers, you freeze the money that's going into the economy. And the other thing that, well, there's other things, of course, but one of the main things that we're going to tackle is that if you're talking about sort of a debt and deficit issue, then you don't just talk about expenditures. That makes no sense. You also have to talk about income. You have to talk about moving back to fair taxation. We've done study after study in Canada of the tax system. We, at one point about 10 years ago, we counted that the federal government alone had cut taxes for wealthy in the corporate sector by about $80 billion a year at the federal level alone. So just moving back to a sensible taxation system that we had before would be a huge step forward. And it's so obvious that in the UK, they got Boris Johnson, who's kind of a slightly smarter Trump, and his hair isn't orange, it's yellow, but it's a mess too. And he, a right-wing conservative prime minister of the UK, is increasing corporate taxes to a level that hasn't been seen for 25 years. Even the right wing in some places can figure it out, that there needs to be a serious addressing of the tax system. And so we're going to be dealing with that issue as strongly as we can. And let me deal with one final point. In Canada, maybe you don't hear it as much in the United States. In Canada, we hear every time there's an issue comes up of governments wanting to cut, they say, well, the private sector's already had the problem. They've already bared the pain. So it's time for the public sector to bear some of that pain along with them. I don't know if I can only see a few heads. I don't know if that's a US phenomenon or not. It's certainly common in Canada. Well, it's, to use a very scientific economic term, it's bullshit. It makes no sense because the private sector did not suffer. The entire private sector didn't suffer during COVID. The entire private sector, some people did, and a lot of people made a lot of money. A lot of private sector workers didn't lose any income at all. So to say that because some people in the private sector had a problem, which they shouldn't have had, that's awful, and I don't justify it at all. But because some people in the private sector had that problem visited on them, then everybody in the public sector should, and that's equity. Again, it makes no sense. It's just an argument made out of whole cloth that justifies what right-wing governments always want to do, which is cut, slash, and burn public services. So we're going to be doing a lot of that kind of stuff. We have really, I think, for the first time in a long time, we have public on our side in a way that has not been the case for a long time, because I think, like Alyssa said, you get into a disaster, and that's when people see the value of the public sector. John was talking about that too. that people saw that it was the public sector workers that stepped up. It was the public sector workers who kept them healthy. It was the public sector workers who kept our jails functioning. It was the public sector workers in Canada who sold them their wine. There was a lot of ways in which the public sector was crucial to the situation that we were facing, and crucial to the downturn not getting any worse. And I think the public by and large sees that. And I think that we are in a position where if too many of our provincial governments start talking about, we spend it all, which is literally not true, but that's a different argument. But if they start saying we spend it all and now we have to visit more austerity on public sector workers, I think we're going to have a bunch of allies that we didn't have before. And we're going to work very hard to make sure that that's the case. So thanks for listening.